So what's going on with Lewis Hamilton really? Because this can't be it surely. This isn't Lewis Hamilton of 2018 or 2007, 2008 even. That dude then, on each of those instances, was an absolute killer in qualifying. I don't care what anybody wants to say. There's been this revisionist history thing going around that once upon a time Lewis Hamilton had never nor will ever be a killer in qualifying, and I'm calling bull feathers on that. Lewis Hamilton is one of the quickest pedalers that we've ever seen, may ever see. And so to say that he was never ever a killer in qualifying, this, ladies and gentlemen, makes no sense. But parlay that into 2024 November of, I'm keen to understand why George Russell, as at the time of writing, is trouncing Lewis Hamilton in qualifying. This makes no sense. Because F1 drivers, we know, have at front and centre of their hearts each and every single time the fact that they are the fastest person in the world coming up through feeder formula. They wouldn't get into F1 if indeed they weren't in their own mind the fastest peddler to have ever pedalled. That's why it must hurt no dent the pride of Sir Lewis each and every single time that Sir King George Russell, Freudian slip, that King George Russell of King's Lynn, Norfolk, outqualifies him. Never even seen which way he goes, right? George Russell roundly, comprehensively outqualifying Sir Lewis Hamilton. And I was racking my brain today trying to understand. And that's when Planet F1 published an article where they've gone into investigative lengths. Excuse me. And I think what they're saying makes sense. Against the backdrop of this ground defect rule spec, you know, because we've been told by paddock insiders that the symbiosis, no combination of these very mercurial tyres, ground defect cars, that all makes this very techie. So too, this iteration of car, super mercurial as far as its handling dynamic, understeery into low minimum hairpin-esque turns, and that's got to count for something, hasn't it, when you consider Lewis Hamilton's multitudinous travails. Here's what Planet F1 have said. They've said, as my pen destroys itself, they've said that Lewis Hamilton keeps making mistakes in qualifying at a very specific point each and every single time, that there is a common denominator. At Bahrain, final turn is where Sir Lewis lost all of his time. At the Australian Grand Prix this year, turns 13 and turns 14, same sort of thing. At Canada, it was the final turn. Lest we forget, Wall of Champions settings. Well, how do you know? Where they went and pulled the sector times, didn't they? Comparing Lewis and George. Lewis is right there through sector 1 and sector 2. The delta cumulatively even being 0.019 between George and Lewis during qualifying. After sector 3, however, that balloons to 0.263, meaning therefore that in sector 3 at Canada alone, Lewis Hamilton, over the course of 30 seconds, lost himself 0.3. That sounds anomalous until you realise that at the Australian Grand Prix in qualifying, turn 13, turn 14, similar instance from Sir Lewis Hamilton, massive snappy oversteer. Chinese Grand Prix 2, turn 14 again, he runs wide. Let's look at the sector times, because that's what Planet F1 have done. Sector 1, the delta between George and Lewis, 0.035, as near as makes no difference. Nothing. Through to sector 2, cumulatively 0.1692 tenths. And then in sector 3, something happens again to Lewis. 0.623 is the cumulative delta again. Lewis Hamilton loses an SH1T load of time to George Russell in sector 3 at China. Same thing at Italy, where over the course of the Ascari chicane, all of the time goes away. Through sector 1, delta between Lewis and George, 0.1. Through sector 2, 0.1 again, stasis. And then sector 3, he loses all his bloody time because he struggles through Ascari. USA Grand Prix, again, Exhibit Z. It's turn 12, he misses the apex. That's where all the time goes. So Lewis Hamilton, I say all that to say this. Lewis Hamilton keeps losing his time towards the latter stage of these qualifying laps. What does that mean? Well, if you consider all of that against the context of what Fernando Alonso said, here's what he attributed the reason why we haven't seen any safety cars as near as makes no difference all season. Fernando Alonso, goatiest F1 mind currently on the grid, I would say. Well, he said that you got to drive these cars, this current rule and reg spec, at 90%. In order to extract 100% of the lap time, you've got to rein it back in. So temperamentally, the symbiosis of this set of rubber and these ground effect cars, it is techie. Therefore, one would argue that Sir Lewis has always been a barbarian in these F1 cars. That's how he's extracted his pace, and therefore this set of car doesn't suit that, doesn't lend itself well to Sir Lewis Hamilton's driving style. James Allison spoke on the Mercedes debrief. He said that if you listen to some of these drivers when they drop it on pole, they're almost surprised. Max Verstappen has said on a multitude of occasions, that's pole. What's going on there? Lando Norris too on a couple of occasions. You'll hear him like, I can't, what? That was a pole lap. And again, that speaks to Fernando Alonso's point, right? That these guys are almost surprised because they're extracting the best of the car when they're driving at less than 100%. Lewis Hamilton, for the avoidance of doubt, is nothing if not a barbarian in these F1 cars. Now, many people have talked about sabotage. Lewis Hamilton has even fanned those flames, saying that sometimes he goes out there and he just loses, something happens, he just loses temperature in his tyres. Are they putting the pressures in? Maybe they're turning down my engine or something. Lewis Hamilton has said he doesn't expect to out-qualify his teammate George Russell, first of his name, for the rest of the season. And this was earlier on. And again, Sir Lewis Hamilton fans around the world said, well, that can only be sabotage. Lewis Hamilton is leaving, George Russell is staying. So they give all the parts, all the preferential treatment, all the setup, all the telemetry goes towards George Russell. But I think something else is going on here. James Allison has told you that he thinks the reason why Lewis is potentially losing time to George Russell, particularly at the end of these qualifying laps, as seems to be the case, is because Lewis is pushing the symbiosis of this set of rubber and these ground effect cars too hard. Ergo, pushing the tyres over the edge as far as the optimal temperature window and degradation. Lest we forget that 2024 is not 1994, where these guys can push over the course of one hot lap in extremis. No. These guys now are having to manage for the tyres over the course of one lap. Such is the rate of expeditious degradation. I say all that to say that Planet F1 have put forth the following supposition, and I will read it verbatim because it's important. Planet F1 say that Lewis's drop-off in performance as versus George Russell can be explained by the fact that perhaps in the final metres of the qualifying attempts, the W15 overheats the tyres too much. This would explain why, for example, the car works best in mixed conditions in Silverstone and at Brazil, and at low temperature tracks like what we saw in Canada and most recently in Las Vegas. This year's Mercedes stands out for having a very sharp front end but very limited rear grip, which together increased overheating on the tyres, making handling more difficult. Andrew Benson talks about this, but let's dissect that for a second, because we know Lewis has a very peculiar driving style. He likes to attack the corner on entry, combined entry. And to do that, of course, you need a pointy front end. This is exactly what Maximilian Verstappen likes. But peculiar to Lewis, you need a very stable rear end on which you can depend. In these circumstances then, with this set of rules, with this very temperamental set of rubber as provided by Pirelli and ground effect cars as well, and the W15 that's knife edgy already, that, ladies and gentlemen, is going to suit George Russell, particularly towards the end of a hot lap in Q3. Andrew Benson expounds upon this thesis. He says as follows, and I read this out verbatim because it's important. When Hamilton has struggled this year, he's talked about lacking confidence in the rear of the car. That's what happened in Brazil again. Las Vegas most recently too. He said at the start of the Las Vegas weekend, if the team gives us a car that doesn't want to throw us off the track, then I will have a good weekend. He did not have this problem in Vegas, but he did mess up his qualifying by mistakes on both his laps in the final session. This was reflective, Andrew Benson of the BBC, of the fact that Hamilton has struggled in qualifying compared to Russell throughout 2024. The feeling, Benson says, and for the avoidance of doubt, all F1 journos are created equal E, but some more equal than others. The feeling, Benson reports, is that Hamilton is pushing too hard in the final moments of qualifying and that the current ground effect cars don't respond well to an aggressive driving style which epitomises Lewis Hamilton. That's his natural way, says Benson. Fernando Alonso also commented on this, saying sometimes it's better to just drive underneath the limit at 90% because it keeps the car's aerodynamic platform more stable and is therefore faster. Imagine this. Around fast, medium to fast speed turns, when the aero is on, again, you need to keep the aerodynamic platform steady because these ground effect cars are aerodynamically sensitive, meaning therefore any aggressive braking or accelerating distorts it, no, lest you be the Red Bull and have yourself anti-dive or anti-squat. That, for the avoidance of doubt, lest we forget, was Adrian Newey's genius. At the same time, says Benson, generally speaking, the Mercedes has had a weakness in slower corners. Again, lap time is lost in these ground effect cars through understeer. Turning it requires the drivers to slide the rear, and that generates higher temperatures. Hamilton has struggled with this much more than his teammate George Russell of Kings Lynn, Norfolk. Benson bookends by saying fundamentally Lewis has been quick this year when the car has been to his liking and he's comfortable with it, such as Silverstone, Spa as an example, both of which he won. Now Las Vegas, however, which he might well have won but for his qualifying errors. There is something going on here, I say to you again, chat. Not necessarily sabotage, not necessarily that Lewis Hamilton is over the hill, but as far as his qualifying pace or lack thereof, Lewis Hamilton keeps dropping the ball at different times, most notably and most frequently towards the latter stages of these laps. Why? Well, by dint of a few things. The mercurial symbiosis that is this rule reg set of tyres and ground effect cars, they are aerodynamically sensitive, if anything. And again, in order to maximise for the downforce, you need to keep the aero platform as stable as anything. So, as per Fernando Alonso's assertion, you might want to, if indeed you harbour aspirations to extract 100% out of these cars as far as lap time, peg it back and drive them at 90%, lest we forget Lewis Hamilton is losing time each and every single time towards the end of these laps as a function of the tyres going off, pushing too hard too soon. As at the 11th, 2024, you need to manage these tyres over the course of a hot lap. For the avoidance of doubt, it is no longer 1994, it is 2024, and we can argue about that all we want to. I don't like that these drivers have to distribute their pace over the course of a qualifying lap. You've got to be joking. I want to see Lewis and George and Charles and Max be able to push hard 100% over the course of a qualifying lap. That's, for the avoidance of doubt, is what qualifying is for. Lest we forget back in the late 80s, 1988 et al., that people used to turn up to Monaco just to see Ayrton Senna push hard. Qualifying was the centrepiece. F1, please, I implore you, don't do this. 2026 new rules and regs, therefore we have an opportunity to see the likes of Lewis Hamilton for once go 100% over 100% of the qualifying lap, because anything else, let's be honest, ladies and gentlemen of the F1 jury, just isn't F1. I mean, what are we doing here?